In this video, we will be replacing the AC compressor and condenser in this 2003 Toyota Camry. Now that the system has been evacuated, we want to take a look inside the engine bay, locating the battery towards the front driver's side portion. We first want to disconnect the negative battery terminal, and then I'll wrap that in a cloth with some tape just to make sure it doesn't accidentally touch anything metal. And taking another look inside the engine bay, we are this time going to identify the alternator located on the passenger side portion. And with that alternator identified, we can clearly see our drive belt running through our various pieces of equipment. We next need to locate the tensioner, which is directly underneath the drive belt as we can view it from the top. And if we look underneath that drive belt, we can see that tensioner nut. Using a ratchet with a 19mm socket, we can hook that up with our tensioner. And we just want to relieve enough pressure to slip it around the alternator. Taking a look below the alternator, we have our AC compressor. On that AC compressor, we also have a wiring harness. On the back side of the wiring harness, there is a small button that needs to be depressed, and then we can wiggle that wiring harness off. At this point, we are going to remove the condensing unit. Taking a look at the front of the engine bay, we first need to unbolt our air inlet for our air filter housing assembly. This is held on by two 10mm bolts. And that is now loose. Taking a look back at the front of the vehicle, we have our uppermost cross brace that has four 10mm bolts that need to be removed. Taking a look at the hood release latch. This connects to a vertical cross member directly in front of the condenser. At the bottom of the vertical cross member, we have an additional 10mm bolt that needs to be removed. And then there are two additional 10mm bolts located about in the center of this vertical bracket on the right side. At this point, our components should be loose, but we are still connected with our horn wiring harnesses. By depressing the button on the back side of the horn wiring harness, we can wiggle that loose. We do have one on either side for each of our horn components. And then we can pivot that bracket out of the way. Make sure you do not hit the battery terminals when you are moving this out of the way. At this point, we have clear access to the condenser. The condenser is held on by two 10mm bolts. Those 10mm bolts holding a bracket, which is connected to the condenser unit. We also have our two AC lines connected to the condenser, one located towards the top and the other located towards the bottom. These are also held on by 10mm bolts. And with those bolts removed, we can wiggle off that line. And we want to bag and tape that to make sure no contamination gets in. We can then work off that second line in the same fashion. And we also want to bag and tape that line to seal it as well. We can then remove the two 10mm nuts holding our condenser brackets. And that condenser unit can then be easily removed. And now is a good time to clean the radiator fins, as we do have this exposed, and this does look pretty dirty. If we take a look at our AC compressor, there is a grouping of wires that runs up near the alternator. We have a hold down clip holding that on the alternator. If we can work that off, it'll allow us to move the electrical wires out of the way slightly. Additionally, towards the bottom of the AC compressor, that same grouping of wires is also held on by another clip. If we work that off, we can then move those wires out of the way, giving us a little bit better access to the AC compressor. Our AC lines are held on by two 10mm nuts. Using a ratchet and a socket, we can loosen those up and remove those. Those then should wiggle off. Now the smaller line is our high side. That's the first one here. And the larger side is our low side. And we'll go ahead and bag that to prevent contaminants from entering the lines. I like to put a piece of tape on it just to make sure that it gets held in place and doesn't fall off. Looking at the top of our AC compressor, we do have two bolts that we need to remove. And then looking at the bottom, we have two additional bolts that need to be removed. At this point, we should be able to work that AC compressor out. Now you will need to push the radiator a little bit out of the way, move the wiring a little bit out of the way. We do have that coolant hose that is a little bit in the way, but it should be able to fit through there fairly easily, but it is tight. And I always like to compare my old part with my new part to make sure that they look the same and that it is the same part. Now it is recommended that we first take a reading from the oil that is in the old compressor. We can do this by tipping the compressor upright into a beaker. And the problem with this compressor is there was no oil in it. So I stood there and held that for a long time and nothing came out. Additionally, our clutch on the front is completely frozen solid, and we kind of got an indication of that when we did our troubleshooting. There was a good chance this failed due to lack of oil. Taking a look at my new unit, I can loosen up the bolts holding on my plugs for both the suction and discharge, and I can remove both of those. This is a pressurized unit, so it might pop just a little bit. And we will take an oil reading on our new unit. Given that my old compressor had no oil in it, there is no clear indication of how much oil should be in it. The service manual has no specification, and the manufacturer also has no specification on their website. And when I inquired the manufacturer, it was indicated that these units come shipped with the appropriate amount of oil. And as I am doing this, I am rotating that clutch to move the oil around inside of this unit. In total, I pulled out 3.5 ounces of compressor oil. So we will be replacing 3.5 ounces of oil back into this compressor. Now I will also be installing this into the suction port because we want it to be sucked into our unit when we rotate that magnetic clutch. And I'm going to rotate that unit to get the oil flowing just a little bit. You do want to be aware that oil might come out if you are not holding it in the correct orientation. And then I'm going to replace my plugs. And this unit is ready to be reinstalled onto the vehicle. We next want to prep the condenser. Our condenser has a dryer with a service port. This uses a 10 millimeter Allen head screw. And this is pressurized, so just keep that in mind. And if we reach inside of there, we can extract the desiccant element kit. Might need to work it around to get it out a little bit. Per the service manual, if you are replacing the condenser, you want to add 1.4 fluid ounces of ND oil 8 or equivalent to the condenser. And then we can replace that desiccant element kit along with our Allen head plug. And this unit is then also ready to reinstall on the vehicle. With our compressor ready to go, we can work that into our engine location. And we want to have our bolts ready so we can start them by hand. And those 4 bolts will get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. And with that new compressor secure, I'm going to install the drive belt, making sure to route that correctly and that we get seated on each of those pulleys properly. Typically at this point, you would go ahead and attach the suction and discharge lines to our ports on the compressor. Now for this repair, I am replacing the liquid line. This is also our high side line. The discharge hose, which connects our compressor to the condenser, and the suction hose, which is also our low side line. I'm just starting with all new components for this vehicle. Taking a look inside the engine bay, we will be focusing our attention towards the passenger side firewall portion of the engine. We are wanting to locate our 2 air conditioner lines going through the firewall. The larger tube is our low side suction line, and the smaller tube is our high side liquid line. Using a Toyota suction tube and liquid tube AC disconnect tool, we can remove these lines. We then want to disconnect these lines and cap them as to reduce the amount of contaminants in the system. Now when attempting to remove these, it is important that you do not use a screwdriver or any type of metal tool. This is very thin walled tubing. It bends very easily. The manual recommends only using your hands. However, this one is on extremely tight, so I'm going to use a trim removal tool to aid in the process. Now to orient ourselves, I have my alternator. Next to my alternator, I have my low side line. Directly below that low side line, I have my high side line. Now my two lines have a bracket holding them in place. This uses a 10mm bolt. And with that bracket loose, we can start working these out. We will begin with our low side line, and this is a little bit challenging because we have to work it underneath the existing components in the engine. Before I remove my high side line, I do have a sensor that I need to disconnect. And much in the same, we can work that high side line underneath everything. Then I have my one last line going from the condenser to the compressor. And this last line, the condenser to the compressor, that is about the easiest one to replace. So we will go ahead and slide that in first. Now before we install them, we will oil the O-rings, but right now we're just setting it in place. Comparing my old part to my new part, I want to make sure that they look like they are the same. I am also going to work the new part into the approximate shape of the old part just by very gently bending these lines just a little bit, just so I am at the approximate shape. Now on my old unit, I do have a sensor. This is a pressure sensor. It is designed to protect the magnetic clutch, essentially, if there are pressure irregularities within the system. Because we are switching out this entire system, we will switch out this sensor as well. And before installing this, I will apply just a little bit of new compressor oil to the rubber O-ring. And I can snug that down with a couple wrenches. And I do have one additional clip that I will transfer, making sure that stays in the same orientation. And then I can begin the process of attempting to feed this back through the engine bay. And I can then feed that low side through there as well. And next I'm going to add my bracket that both of these lines are held on with. And at this point we are ready to install our new condenser into place. And we can add our nuts on our mounting bracket. On our condenser, we can prep our port for installing our line. There is a plug that needs to be removed before we begin to install that line. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of new compressor oil to the rings to help this seal a little better. And we have the same procedure for our lower high side line. We do have a cap with a plug that needs to be removed. And then we can install our new line. And a little bit of compressor oil on these rings as well. And then we can connect that pressure switch. These then need to be torqued to 7 foot-pounds. And then we can connect our 2 lines on our compressor. And again, I'm going to apply a little bit of new compressor oil to my O-rings. And then I can connect my 2 lines. And these will also get torqued to 7 foot-pounds. We then need to connect our lines to the firewall side of our engine. And again, we will be applying some new compressor oil to these rubber O-rings. Make sure those are nice and tight. And we can add our retainers. And then we have our wiring harness for our compressor. And we can then begin assembling the front, hooking up our wiring harnesses for the horns, and then adding the rest of the bolts. And then we can reattach the battery. And at this point, our repair is complete. The next step is to recharge the system and test everything out.